saw the good, the bad, the ugly. I saw those I wanted to emulate and those I wanted to get as far away from as I possibly could, especially the ones who missed the riot, so they staged it after it was all over because they were late and they needed some footage. So I learned a lot during that period. And then I think I came of age in journalism at a most important moment in American history. 1968, everybody here will, let me see if there are gray hairs out here, will remember was the year that Martin Luther King was assassinated, that President Johnson, the cities of America exploded in riots and rebellions, as some would say. And the Kerner Commission came out with two conclusions. A lot of people latched on to the one where they said this was two societies, one black and one white. The thing that stuck with most of us who were in the field at that time was the culpability that the Kerner Commission attached to the media, that the media were as much to blame as anybody because there was nobody virtually who looked like the people who were so aggrieved that they burned up their own homes, reporting on their grievances. And so it was at that point that the major media, television and print, began to bring in people of color to go into communities that presumably they knew more about than those who had reported on them before, because the riots were a big surprise to America. And anyone who lived in those communities would have known the kind of grievances that people had. So when I came into the media at that point, it seemed to me that what was missing was accurate portrayals of people of color. Portrayals of people in such a way that they were recognizable to themselves. And as my friend, the late Ed Bradley, used to say, nothing changes but the date. I still think that we have trouble with that. I still think we have trouble accurately portraying people in ways that are recognizable to themselves. For a number of years, I worked for the New Yorker, the New York Times, and others. And I always remember this one episode when I went to Harlem, and the Black Panthers at that point, this was early 70s, were trying to reinvent themselves away from this image of the violent West Coast revolutionaries into nice guys and women who fed children breakfast for free. And as I walked up to the press conference and showed my credentials, at that time the New York Times, this Black Panther in his black beret looked at me and he said, you ain't coming in here. And I said, well, why not? He said, because you work for the man. I said, what do you mean? He says, you work for the man, and there's no way the man is going to allow you to tell the truth. I didn't want to tell him at that point. The Times was known as the Gray Lady, but because that was neither here nor there. I had other things, other fish to fry. And so I said, look, have you ever seen anything I've written? He said, no. And I said, well, let's make a deal. If you let me come into this press conference, if what you see in the New York Times tomorrow isn't an accurate reflection of what went on here, don't let me in the next press conference. Can we make a deal? So he says, all right, but under one condition. And I said, what is that? He said, you've got to come in right. And you see, I think that that is one of our big problems that continues in the media. People don't come in right. What he meant by that was check your predispositions, your preconceptions at the door, and you know, okay, have background in the thing, but let the circumstances determine what you write. And that was certainly true. I mean, I had some challenges, but basically knowing in those days, I embedded myself in Harlem and in black communities around the country, and I knew more than my editors. So when I was challenged about something, I was able to say something that indicated that I knew more than they did, and 9 times out of 10, they accepted it. I won't tell you about the 10th time. And then I went, as Ntozake Shange, the poet, used to say, I used to live in the world, and then I moved to Harlem. Well, I used to live in Harlem, and then I moved to the world, principally Africa. And when I got to Africa, this Black Panther's admonition was in the back of my head. I had to come in right. I just want to share this one thing, and then we can talk some more about what I think needs to happen. But I encountered the work of a young Kenyan whose name is Binyavanga Wanena. And he has this little book out called How to Write About Africa. And in it, he writes some tips. Sunsets and starvation are good. Always use the word Africa or darkness or safari in your title. Subtitles may include the words Zanzibar, Maasai, Zulu, Zambezi, Congo, Nile, Big Sky, Shadow, Drum, Sun, or Bygone. Always useful are words such as guerrillas, timeless, primordial, and tribal. Note that people means Africans who are not Black, while the people means Black Africans. And then he says, never have a picture of a well-adjusted African on the cover of your book or in it unless that African has won the Nobel Prize. Just indulge me for another second.
Go ahead.
I mean, this is too good.
Just stay right. Just stay
Describe in detail naked breasts, young, old, conservative, recently raped, big, small, or mutilated genitals, or enhanced genitals, or any kind of genitals, and dead bodies, or better, naked dead bodies, and especially rotting naked dead bodies. Remember, any work you submit in which people look filthy and miserable will be referred to as the real Africa, and you want that on your dust jacket. Now, uncharacteristically, I was quoting another author other than myself. I will now quote myself in my book. I call this looking at Africa through the prism of the 4 Ds, death, disease, disaster, and despair, which is the majority of the kind of reporting that you get about Africa. But it's not just limited to Africa. It's the coverage that we get of people who are known as the other. And as I have arrived here 20 hours and some plus from Johannesburg to be on this panel, Professor, I have to say that when I turn on the television, I am simply amazed. Ed, you were so right. Nothing changes but the date. So I have some ideas about how we can change this, and I'll just say this and end it and hope we can come back to it. I think we need a new definition of news.
Interesting. Michael.
Thank you, Ernie. Before we segue into the autobiographical, and I'll be happy to go there, but I just want to start off by saying that before we consign the warnings of George Orwell to the artifacts of a previous media environment, we need to take stock of the media environment in which we live. So in that sense, I am not here to bury George Orwell, but to praise him. I don't pretend to be an expert interpreter on the collected works of George Orwell, but still his warnings about the abuses of power or the self-justifying propaganda of elites, or about the ability of misinformation or disinformation to make us each complicit in our own manipulation, have in effect had an impact on how I go about my job of trying to regulate the broadcast media in particular to the benefit of the public interest. And I suppose part of that job is to make sure that we don't all end up as Winston's shedding tears of happiness that we have won the victory over ourselves, and now we are all in love with big media. I don't think that that's an inevitable outcome, but I would stress that we are far down the road of strangling the civic democratic dialogue in this country and of repressing the diversity and the creativity of the communities that comprise the United States of America, and it happened thusly.